Somewhere in the National Archives, in federal court records, in engineering reports commissioned by the government and never featured on any tour, the actual histories of America's most recognized landmarks have been waiting. Not legend, not rumor. Documented records, ledgers, correspondence, structural surveys, legal findings that contradict what every official interpreter has delivered at every official entrance. This list ranks 10 sites by the scale of that contradiction, from structural omissions to political erasures to moral reckonings that took 2 centuries to reach a plaque. The entries escalate. What is waiting at number 1 has been in the Federal Archive since the Republic's first decade. The docent's script is polished. It has been rehearsed, approved, and delivered 10,000 times in 10,000 identical inflections. It tells you when the cornerstone was laid, who signed what, and where to find the gift shop. What it does not tell you is what the archive holds. The letters, the ledgers, the survey reports, the engineering records, the court transcripts. The gap between those 2 versions of history is not accidental. It was made. This list is ranked by the distance between the official story and the documented record, and by what that distance cost. Number 10, the Statue of Liberty's original dedication dispute, Liberty Island, New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty was proposed as a monument to the emancipation of American slaves. By the time it was unveiled, that meaning had been removed from every official speech. The conceptual origins of the statue are documented in the correspondence and public writings of Édouard de La Boulaye, a French historian, jurist, and committed abolitionist, who first proposed the monument in 1865, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, in explicit celebration of shared democratic liberation, including the liberation of enslaved people. The sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi received the commission and began designing. Early accounts describe sketches influenced by Egyptian colossal figures, monumental, dark-robed, female, and some historians have noted that Bartholdi traveled to Egypt before beginning the final design. What is documented in Bartholdi's own construction records is simpler and more durable than any sketch. The broken chains are there. Cast in the original copper at the statue's feet, they are part of the monument as built, not added later. Laboulaye died in 1883, 3 years before the dedication he had conceived and spent nearly 2 decades advancing. He did not hear President Grover Cleveland's dedication speech on October 28, 1886. He did not hear what was absent from it. The word emancipation did not appear. The chains at the statue's feet were not mentioned. The Civil War was not mentioned. The dedication framed the monument as a symbol of French-American friendship and Republican government in the abstract. A gift between allied nations, not a monument to the specific, violent, unresolved struggle over human freedom that had produced it. Black American civil rights leaders were not invited to the dedication ceremony. The stands and viewing areas were segregated. A black civil rights newspaper, the Cleveland Gazette, published an editorial in 1886 arguing directly that the statue was a hypocrisy until Black Americans were free in practice as well as in law. The editorial is documented. It was written and published in the same year as the dedication. It did not appear in any official record of the event. The chains are still there. They are not visible from the ground. A visitor standing at the base of the statue on the star-shaped fort foundation of Fort Wood, looking up at the copper face above them, cannot see them. They require a view from above, an aerial photograph, a construction diagram, deliberate attention. Bartholdi put them there. The dedication ceremony looked past them. What the record cannot resolve is whether the removal of emancipation from the monument's public meaning was a deliberate political decision made by specific individuals or whether it was the accumulated effect of dozens of smaller omissions, each one individually defensible, together amounting to erasure. The correspondence that would answer that question directly has not been located. What remains is the statue, the chains no one mentions, and a dedication speech that does not say what the monument was built to say. There is one additional detail the standard tour does not include. The torch was not designed to be decorative. Bartholdi petitioned the United States government to use the Statue of Liberty as a functioning lighthouse for New York Harbor. The Lighthouse Board accepted. The torch operated as a navigational aid for a brief period before the board determined the light was insufficient for maritime purposes and decommissioned it in 1902. The most recognized symbol of American welcome was briefly, officially, a lighthouse. It was found inadequate. The designation was removed. The torch has been lit, in one form or another, ever since, but it no longer guides ships. It no longer guides anything. It simply burns, visible for miles, above the chains that nobody mentions. Number 9. The Washington Monument's two-tone stone, the National Mall, Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument is not one structure. It is two, built 22 years apart by different organizations using different marble from different quarries. The seam between them is visible from the street. Almost no one on the standard tour is told to look for it. The cornerstone was laid on July 4, 1848, by the Washington National Monument Society, a private organization funded by public donation. Construction proceeded slowly. The base is massive, the logistics were considerable, and the donations were inconsistent. By 1854, the society had exhausted its funds at approximately 152 feet, roughly one-third of the planned height. The structure was abandoned. It stood incomplete, open at the top, exposed to weather for 25 years. During the Civil War, the unfinished stump served as a cattle pen and slaughterhouse for the Union Army. Period accounts document that the smell reached the White House. The abandonment was accelerated by an act of political vandalism that has largely disappeared from popular memory. In 1854, Pope Pius IX donated a block of marble from the Temple of Concord in Rome for inclusion in the monument's interior wall, where stones contributed by states, cities, and foreign governments were being installed. The Know Nothing Party, a nativist political movement opposed to Catholic immigration, stole the papal stone, threw it into the Potomac River, and briefly seized control of the Monument Society through a fraudulent election. Private funding never recovered. Construction under society oversight effectively ended. Congress appropriated funds for completion in 1876. The Army Corps of Engineers resumed construction in 1879. By that point, the original Maryland marble source, the Cockeysville Quarry, had been exhausted at the required grade. Marble from a different stratum of the same quarry was used for the upper two-thirds of the structure. The color's close, it is not identical. The line where the two stones meet, approximately 150 feet from the base, is visible to the naked eye as a slight but unmistakable tonal shift in the obelisk's facing. The aluminum capstone placed at the peak in December 1884 was, at the time of its installation, the largest single piece of aluminum ever cast. Aluminum was then more expensive than silver. The material was chosen for its conductivity. The capstone was designed to function as a lightning rod, not as a decorative flourish. A metal chosen for its rarity and cost was put at the top of a national monument and told to absorb lightning. The Know-Nothing stone was never recovered from the river. The interior wall retains the gap where it was meant to go. What the record does not resolve is this: the monument that memorializes the founding of a republic stood incomplete, abandoned, and reeking of slaughter for longer than it took to build it. That fact is in the construction record. It is not on the placard. The monument's fracture is written in its surface for anyone who looks up at the right angle in the right light. What is buried beneath the Lincoln Memorial requires no visual evidence. It is documented in the construction records, acknowledged in National Park Service technical literature, and almost entirely absent from the tour. Number 8. The Battle of Alcatraz, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay, California. In May of 1946, a prison break attempt became a 3-day military siege that killed 5 people, wounded 85, and produced a criminal proceeding. The Bureau of Prisons worked systematically to keep away from the press. It is not a rumor. It is in the court record. It is in the Bureau's own administrative files. And it receives a fraction of the interpretive attention given to a single escape attempt 16 years later. The sequence began on the morning of May 2, 1946. Inmate Bernard Coy had spent months studying the movements of the officer who patrolled the gun gallery, an elevated cage running above the main cell block that held the institution's rifles, clubs, and cell keys. Coy had observed that the officer occasionally set his rifle against the bars while making his rounds. Using a homemade bar spreader fashioned from plumbing hardware, Coy forced a gap in the gallery bars wide enough to squeeze through, overpowered the officer, and seized the weapons. He passed firearms down to 5 co-conspirators: Joseph Kretzer, Marvin Hubbard, Sam Shockley, Miran Thompson, and Clarence Carnes. The plan required a specific key, number 107, that would open the door to the recreation yard and from there to the dock. The key had been returned to the rack in the gun gallery following a routine cell check. It was the wrong key. The door to the yard did not open. The escape route was closed before it began. What happened next was not an escape. It was a siege. The 6 inmates retreated into the utility corridor that ran between the cell blocks, a narrow maintenance passage behind the cell walls, dark, unventilated, accessible only through service hatches. They took hostages. Officer William Miller and 5 other guards were locked inside a cell. Kretzer, realizing the escape had failed, shot the hostages through the cell bars. Miller died. Captain of the guard. Harold Stites, responding to the emergency, was shot during the counter-assault. He died the following day. The Bureau of Prisons called for military assistance. United States Marines were deployed to the island. For 2 days, Marine units and federal officers fired into the cell block from exterior positions, used mortars from the dock, and detonated hand grenades inside the building to breach the utility corridor. The physical evidence of that assault, impact craters in the concrete, repaired sections in the cell block walls, was documented in post-battle photographs and remained visible for years afterward. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard were found dead in the utility corridor on May 4th. Their deaths were ruled justified force. The 2 surviving adult conspirators, Shockley and Thompson, were tried in federal court. Both were convicted of murder under a legal theory of joint responsibility for the deaths that occurred during the escape attempt. Both were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison on December 3, 1948. Clarence Carnes, who was 18 at the time of the siege and had not fired a weapon, received a life sentence rather than execution. His age and the testimony about his conduct during the hostage situation were factors the court weighed. He remained incarcerated until 1973. The press coverage during the siege was controlled by the Bureau of Prisons. No independent journalists were permitted on the island while the military action was ongoing. Wire service reports were based entirely on Bureau statements. The Bureau characterized the event as a disturbance that had been brought under control, which was accurate in the narrowest possible sense, and said nothing about the scope of what had actually occurred. One detail from the court record deserves specific attention. Officer Bert Birch, one of the guards taken hostage, was shot in the leg by Kretzer during the execution attempt inside the cell. Birch survived by lying still and allowing Kretzer to believe he was dead. His testimony at the Shockley-Thompson trial described what the cell looked like, what was said, and the sequence in which Kretzer fired. That testimony is part of the federal court record. It has not been incorporated into any official Alcatraz interpretive display as of the most recent review of the National Park Service materials on the island. The National Park Service took over Alcatraz in 1972, after the island's federal penitentiary closed in 1963, and following a 19-month occupation by Native American activists. The Park Service acknowledges the Battle of Alcatraz in its written materials. The standard audio tour, the one most visitors experience as they walk through the cell block, devotes considerably more time to the 1962 escape attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers than to a military siege that killed 2 officers and 3 inmates and required the United States Marine Corps to retake a federal building by force. The cell block where the siege occurred is the same cell block visitors walk through today. The floor is the same floor, the bars are the same bars or replacements fitted to the original frames. The repaired sections of concrete are there if you know where to look. The utility corridor is still behind the walls. The hatches that the inmates used to enter it are still in the structure. What the record does not resolve is the question of what the Bureau of Prisons understood it was managing in the weeks and months after the siege. The repairs were completed quickly. Operations resumed. The press had been kept off the island. The legal proceedings were handled through the federal court system without significant public scrutiny. Whether the speed of the institutional response reflected professional emergency management or something more deliberate in its intent to contain the narrative is not established in any document that has been made public. Alcatraz's omission is a matter of institutional emphasis, an agency choosing which violence to foreground and which to leave in the maintenance corridor. The Lincoln Memorial's omission is different in kind. It is architectural, geological, and preserved not by choice, but by the simple fact that no one sealed the door. Number 6. Hoover Dam's reclassified dead, Boulder City, Nevada, at the Arizona border on the Colorado River. The claim that workers are buried in the concrete of Hoover Dam is one of the most repeated legends in American infrastructure history. The Bureau of Reclamation calls it false. What the construction records actually show is more complicated than either the legend or the denial. Construction began on July 7, 1930. The scale of what was built in the 5 years that followed is difficult to hold in a single frame. Hoover Dam required 4.36 million cubic yards of concrete, sufficient by the Bureau's own estimate to pave a 2-lane road from San Francisco to New York City. The concrete was not poured as a single continuous mass. It was laid in interlocking rectangular columns, each section no more than 5 feet deep, with each pour inspected before the next began. This method was chosen specifically to manage the heat generated by curing concrete at that scale. It also means, structurally, that a body introduced into a column during pouring would have been visible to the inspection crew before the next layer sealed it. The Bureau's denial of the buried worker legend is, on this technical point, plausible. What the denial does not address is the question of how many men died building the dam and how those deaths were classified. The official figure is 96 workers. This number appears on the dedication plaque installed at the dam in 1935 and is cited in every Bureau of Reclamation official history of the project. It represents deaths that occurred on site and were formally classified as industrial accidents under the terms of the construction contracts. It does not include workers who died from heat prostration, which the Bureau's own industrial physicians recorded in numerous contemporaneous cases as pneumonia. It does not include deaths that occurred off-site during transit to and from the work camp or in the Boulder City Hospital in the days following an incident, and it does not include deaths from the pre-construction survey phase. The first recorded death connected to the Hoover Dam project was J.G. Tierney, a Bureau of Reclamation surveyor who drowned in the Colorado River on December 20, 1922. While conducting a site survey, his name is not on the dedication plaque. The formal construction period had not yet begun. 13 years later, on December 20, 1935, the same calendar date, his son, Patrick Tierney, fell from one of the dam's intake towers and died. Both deaths are documented in Bureau records. The symmetry is not folklore, it is in the ledger. Carbon monoxide poisoning from gasoline-powered equipment operating inside the diversion tunnels killed workers throughout the early construction phase. The tunnels, cut through the canyon walls to redirect the Colorado River during the dam's construction, were poorly ventilated. Workers collapsed, some died. In the official mortality records, these deaths were attributed to pneumonia. The Bureau of Reclamation subsequently settled wrongful death claims brought by the families of workers under this classification, acknowledging in legal terms a causal link between working conditions and death that the official pneumonia designation obscured. The Industrial Medicine Review conducted in the 1990s estimated the actual death toll. When heat-related and carbon monoxide deaths are included alongside the classified industrial accidents, was substantially higher than 96. The precise figure has not been established and has not been the subject of any published government accounting that reconciles the two numbers. The plaque on the dam lists 96 names. It is a bureaucratic boundary drawn around a specific category of death during a specific period of time. It is accurate within those limits. Outside those limits, it is silent. What the record cannot resolve is whether the reclassification of heat and carbon monoxide deaths as pneumonia was a deliberate institutional decision to minimize the liability exposure of the contracting firms and the Bureau, or whether it reflected the genuine limitations of industrial medicine in the early 1930s. Both explanations have documentary support. Neither fully accounts for the subsequent settlement of wrongful death claims under a classification that required acknowledging the original designation was inadequate. The dam stands, the Colorado River is behind it. The intake towers where Patrick Tierney fell are visible from the visitor overlook. The plaque is mounted at the Nevada approach. The reclassification documents are in the Bureau of Reclamation archive in Denver. The gap between the number on the plaque and the number in the archive has not been closed by any official act in any official forum in the 90 years since the dam was dedicated. If you find this kind of documented history useful, the gap between the official number and the actual record, subscribe to Origins Archive. We go to the archive on every entry, every video. Number 5 is next. Number 5, Mount Rushmore's unfinished Hall of Records, Keystone, Pennington County, South Dakota, in the Black Hills. Behind Abraham Lincoln's hairline, blasted into the granite by dynamite crews in 1939, there is a room that the public has never seen. It was not a structural feature, and it was not an afterthought. It was, according to the sculptor who designed it, the monument's entire purpose. Gutzon Borglum began carving Mount Rushmore on October 4, 1927, under a commission from the state of South Dakota and with funding from the Mount Rushmore National Memorial Commission. The 4 presidential faces, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, were never, in Borglum's conception, the monument's primary statement. They were the facade. The real work was to be an 80-foot-long, 100-foot-high chamber carved into the granite behind the sculpture, accessible by a grand stairway cut into the canyon wall, containing a permanent repository of American civilization. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, a complete history of the presidency, and a record of how the mountain itself was carved. Borglum called it the Hall of Records. He believed it would survive for hundreds of thousands of years. He considered the faces to be the sign above the door. Excavation of the Hall of Records began in 1939. Dynamite crews cleared approximately 75 feet into the granite before the Mount Rushmore National Memorial Commission, under pressure from Congress to complete the presidential faces before any further funds were allocated, ordered the work suspended. Borglum died in March of 1941, of complications following surgery before either the faces or the hall were complete. His son, Lincoln Borglum, supervised a final season to stabilize what had been carved. Congress declined to appropriate the additional funds that would have continued the work. The Hall of Records was left in the condition it was when Gutzon Borglum last walked into it. An unfinished cavity in the mountain, open at the entrance, accumulating decades of South Dakota weather. In 1998, the Borglum family and the National Park Service installed a repository inside the unfinished chamber. A teakwood box sealed inside a titanium capstone set into the floor of the entrance passage contains porcelain enamel panels inscribed with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, biographical information on each of the 4 presidents depicted, and a history of the monument's construction. The installation was documented in a National Park Service press release. It was not incorporated into any interpretive display at the monument. The titanium capstone is there, in the granite, behind the sculpture, beneath the surface of the trail that leads to the sculptor's studio. It is not on the tour. The selection of the 4 presidents is itself a detail the standard interpretation handles carefully. Borglum's working notes show that the final choice of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt was determined in part by the available granite. The mountain dictated certain constraints: the angle of the rock face, the grain of the stone, the structural integrity of specific sections. Borglum worked from the available stone outward toward historical symbolism, not from historical canon inward toward available stone. The faces that represent American greatness were chosen partly because the rock cooperated. The legal and moral status of the land on which the monument stands is a documented, open, unresolved dispute that the monument's interpretive programming does not address with the directness the record warrants. The Black Hills are the He Sapa, the sacred center of Lakota Sioux territory, guaranteed to the Lakota Nation under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. The United States federal government seized the Black Hills following the discovery of gold in 1874. The land was never purchased. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled, in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians, that the seizure had been unlawful and awarded $102 million in compensation. The Lakota Nation refused the payment. They have refused it every year since. The award, with accumulated interest, had grown to over $1 billion as of 2023. The official position of Lakota tribal leadership remains unchanged. The Black Hills are not for sale. The Hall of Records sits behind the faces, unfinished, sealed, holding its 1998 deposit. The Lakota refusal continues. Both facts are documented. Neither appears on the standard interpretive tour at the monument's visitor center. Number 4. The the President's House, and the deliberate rotation system 1 block from Independence Hall at 190 High Street, now Market Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. George Washington did not simply own enslaved people while serving as the first president of the United States. He engineered a legal mechanism documented in his own correspondence to prevent Pennsylvania law from freeing them. That mechanism operated from the building where he governed. The letter describing it is in the Library of Congress. The intent it records is stated without ambiguity. Philadelphia became the temporary national capital in November of 1790. The President's House, a private mansion leased by the federal government at the corner of 6th and Market Streets, became Washington's official residence for the duration of the capital's time in Pennsylvania. Washington brought 9 enslaved people with him from Mount Vernon. Their names are preserved in his household records: Hercules, Oney Judge, Christopher Shields, Giles, Paris, Richmond, Austin, Moll, and Joe. They cooked, cleaned, served at table, dressed the president, and maintained the household that represented the executive authority of the new republic. Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act, passed in 1780, contained a specific provision relevant to Washington's situation. Any enslaved person who resided in Pennsylvania for more than 6 consecutive months could petition the courts for freedom. The law applied to everyone, including explicitly the household of the President of the United States. Washington was informed of this provision shortly after his arrival. His response was methodical. In correspondence with his secretary Tobias Lear, Washington outlined a rotation system. The 9 enslaved people in his household would be transported back across the Virginia state line before the 6-month threshold elapsed, breaking the continuity of their Pennsylvania residency and resetting the legal clock. They would then be returned to Philadelphia. The system required careful tracking of each person's arrival date to ensure no individual accumulated the consecutive months required to petition. Washington wrote to Lear in April of 1791 with explicit instructions on how this was to be managed. The letter includes the following. He wished to have it accomplished under some pretext that might deceive both the enslaved people and the public. That language is not paraphrased. It is in the document. The document is in the Library of Congress. The rotation continued for the duration of Washington's Philadelphia residency. From November 1790 through March 1797, 6 years, 9 people moved across state lines on a schedule calibrated to the threshold of a freedom law. Oney Judge discovered the plan. She had worked as a seamstress and personal attendant in the household and had, according to her own account given in 2 newspaper interviews in 1845 and 1847, heard that she was to be given as a wedding gift to one of Martha Washington's granddaughters. In May of 1796, she slipped away from the President's House while the family was at dinner and boarded a ship to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She was 23 years old. Washington did not accept her departure. He employed a network of federal contacts in New Hampshire, including the customs collector at Portsmouth, Joseph Whipple, whose correspondence with Washington on the matter is preserved, to locate Judge and arrange her return. She refused. She told Whipple she would return voluntarily only if promised her freedom upon Washington's death. Washington declined that condition. He made additional attempts to recapture her through a nephew. All of them failed. Oney Judge died free in Greenland, New Hampshire in February of 1848. She was 75 years old. She had outlived Washington by nearly 50 years. The President's House itself was demolished in the 19th century. Its footprint, directly adjacent to Independence Hall on Chestnut Street, was built over across successive decades. When construction began on the current Liberty Bell Center in the early 2000s, archaeologists excavating the site in 2002 discovered the foundation of the slave quarters, the physical remnant of the structure where the 9 enslaved members of Washington's household had lived, worked, and been subject to a rotation schedule designed to prevent their legal freedom. The slave quarters foundation was found beneath what became the main visitor entrance to the Liberty Bell Pavilion. A memorial installation now stands at the site. It was built after sustained public advocacy following the archaeological discovery, and it acknowledges the 9 enslaved people by name. It is there. The memorial is real, and it is recent. What places this entry at number 4 is the nature of the documentation. The rotation system is not alleged, it is not inferred from circumstantial evidence or reconstructed from secondary sources. It is described in Washington's own handwriting in a letter that also describes the conscious decision to deceive both the enslaved people and the public about its purpose. The distance between that letter and the Declaration of Independence, which had been signed in the building 1 block away 14 years earlier, is measurable in footsteps. The moral distance is a matter the record leaves open without resolution. John Adams, who succeeded Washington in the President's House and resided there from 1797 to 1800, brought no enslaved people to Philadelphia. Adams opposed slavery on principled grounds, a position documented throughout his private correspondence across his lifetime. 2 men held the same office, worked from the same address, governed under the same constitution. One maintained a system to prevent the freedom of the people in his household. The other did not. That contrast is not a feature of the standard interpretive tour at Independence Hall or at the Liberty Bell Center. It is in the correspondence of both men. The archive holds both. Washington's letter to Tobias Lear remains in the Library of Congress. Oney Judge's testimony remains in the newspaper archives of the New Hampshire Gazette and the Granite Freeman. The Slave Quarters Foundation remains preserved beneath the Liberty Bell Pavilion floor. The memorial installation is there for anyone who looks directly at it, which requires only turning slightly away from the bell itself. Washington's rotation system was a legal instrument, constructed around the edges of a law, executed with deliberate concealment, and committed to paper by the man who designed it. The next entry was never committed to paper. The institution responsible spent 61 years ensuring that no written record would ever force a formal decision. Number 3. The Golden Gate Bridge's 60-year net delay. Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco, California. The Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District had access to evidence by the early 1950s that a physical barrier would prevent deaths. The net was not approved until 2014. It was not operational until 2023. In the interval between the first formal proposal and the completed installation, the confirmed death toll from the bridge exceeded 2,000 people. The bridge opened on May 27, 1937. It had been designed without any suicide prevention infrastructure. The first documented suicide occurred within 3 months of opening. By the mid-1950s, public health researchers and advocacy groups had begun formally petitioning the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District, the governing authority responsible for the bridge's operation and maintenance, to install a physical barrier along the pedestrian walkway. The district's response, documented in its own public meeting minutes across 7 decades, was to consider the proposals and decline them. The documented reasons changed over time but were consistent in their conclusion. In the early years, cost was the primary stated objection. In later decades, the objections expanded to include aesthetics. The argument that a barrier or net would alter the bridge's visual profile and diminish its appeal to the millions of tourists who visit it annually. There was also the substitution argument, the claim, repeated at multiple district meetings across multiple decades, that individuals intent on suicide would simply find another location if the bridge were made inaccessible. Each of these reasons is documented in the district's own records. Each of them was used at various points to defer action. The substitution argument was tested empirically. Richard Seiden, a public health researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, conducted a study published in 1978 that tracked 515 individuals who had been physically prevented from jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge between 1937 and 1971. At the time of the study, approximately 94% of those 515 people were still alive or had died of causes unrelated to suicide. The substitution argument and the central justification for inaction across 3 decades of district meetings was empirically false. Seiden's study was available to the district from 1978 onward. The net was not approved for another 36 years. The Bridge Authority's own records show the net concept was raised formally in 1953, in 1970, in 1998, and repeatedly throughout the 2000s before a vote in 2014 finally approved construction. The $211 million project was funded through a combination of federal transportation grants, state funds, and regional Bridge Authority revenue. The Bridge Authority had cited cost as a prohibitive obstacle for decades. The final approved budget was comparable in scale to a standard Bay Area highway interchange project, a category of infrastructure expenditure the region undertook routinely. What places this entry at number 3 is a specific quality of the documented record. The Golden Gate Bridge's death toll is not an accident, and it is not a mystery. It is a sequence of meetings, votes, studies, and deferrals, each one dated, each one attributed, each one on file. The gap between the 1978 Sidon study and the 2014 approval vote is 36 years. Every year within that gap has a corresponding district meeting record. Every record shows a body that reviewed the evidence and chose not to act. The net itself is not what most people picture. It does not hang vertically from the bridge railing like a fence. It extends horizontally from the bridge's sides, approximately 20 feet below the pedestrian walkway level, projecting outward over the water on a system of steel brackets. A person who clears the railing falls into the net rather than continuing to the water below. The design was chosen because a vertical barrier would have required significant structural modification to the bridge's original tower anchorage points. Modifications the district determined were architecturally unacceptable. The horizontal net was the solution that preserved the bridge's appearance while providing the intervention. It was the compromise that took 81 years to approve. The net became operational on September 26, 2023. The meeting minutes from every year of delay are public record, available through the district's document archive. Sidon's 1978 study remains in print. The confirmed death count, documented by the Marin County Coroner's Office and the bridge's own incident records, exceeds 2,000. Because a significant proportion of deaths from the bridge are unwitnessed and the bodies are carried out to sea by the current. The actual total is estimated to be higher than the confirmed figure. What the record cannot resolve is whether the pattern of deferrals constitutes negligence in any legally cognizable sense, or whether each individual decision, considered in isolation and in its own moment, falls within the range of defensible institutional judgment. Courts have consistently declined to hold the district liable. The district has consistently maintained that it acted in good faith. What is not in dispute is the record itself, the dates, the votes, the studies, the deferrals, and the confirmed deaths that accumulated across each interval between them. The bridge stands, the net is in place. The orange towers rise above the fog on the same alignment they have held since 1937, and the view from the pedestrian walkway is, by the district's own architectural assessment, effectively unchanged. The horizontal mesh is visible from the water below, if you know to look for it. From the walkway itself, looking out toward the bay, the bridge presents the same profile it always has. The Golden Gate Bridge's record is one of institutional decision-making, choices that were made, reviewed, revisited, and deferred across 6 decades of formal governance. What the next entry holds is a different register entirely. The choice at number 2 was made in a single night, under fire, and what it left behind has been standing and hiding in plain sight for more than 200 years. Number 2. The White House's burned walls, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. The White House was gutted by fire on the night of August 24, 1814. The walls standing today, the walls behind every presidential address, every press briefing, every state dinner, are, in substantial part, the same walls that British soldiers set alight that night. They were not replaced. They were patched, refinished, and painted over. The fire is still in the building. It has been there for more than 200 years. The sequence of events on that evening is documented in British military accounts, American government correspondence, and the private letters of both the occupying officers and the American officials who fled the city. Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross led British forces into Washington following the American defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg earlier that day. President James Madison had evacuated hours before the British arrived. First Lady Dolly Madison had remained at the Executive Mansion until the last practicable moment, organizing the removal of documents, silver, and a portrait of George Washington attributed to Gilbert Stuart. This sequence of events documented in her own correspondence and in the accounts of servants present that afternoon. The British officers entered a house that was set for dinner. The table had been laid. The food was prepared. According to the account of Cockburn's aide-de-camp, published in a London newspaper in September 1814, The officers sat down, ate the meal, roasted meats, wines, desserts, and then proceeded to destroy the building. Rocket charges were used to ignite the interior. Furniture was stacked and set alight. The fire consumed the floors, the staircase, the original roof structure, and every furnishing inside the building. The sandstone exterior walls, quarried from Aquia Creek in Virginia beginning in 1792, survived. They were too substantial to collapse. They stood, smoke-blackened and cracked in places, while the interior burned entirely away around them. Architect James Hoban, who had designed the original building, was commissioned to oversee the reconstruction. He rebuilt the interior largely according to his original plans. The exterior walls were cleaned, repaired where the fire had cracked or spalled the stone, and repainted white, which they had been before. Whether that repainting served additionally to conceal the evidence of smoke damage and patching work is a question that architectural historians have raised and not fully resolved. What is documented is that the repainting occurred immediately following the reconstruction and that the repairs to the sandstone were incorporated behind the painted surface rather than replaced. The walls held. They have held through every administration since. Structural assessments conducted during the 1948 to 1952 Truman renovation established how much of the original fabric survived. That renovation gutted the White House interior entirely, removing flooring, walls, ceilings, and mechanical systems, while retaining the exterior sandstone shell. Engineers examining the walls during that process documented significant deterioration in the original stone. Moisture infiltration over more than 150 years, residual fire damage from 1814, and the accumulated stress of repeated renovation cycles. The decision to retain the walls rather than demolish and rebuild from new stone was made explicitly on grounds of historical continuity. The engineers' reports, available in the National Archives, confirm that retention was not the structurally optimal choice. It was the historically necessary one. The Aquia Creek quarry where the original stone was cut is documented as having employed enslaved laborers beginning in 1792. The same quarry supplied stone for the United States Capitol. The walls of the White House and the walls of the Capitol were cut by some of the same hands, a connection that the standard interpretive tour of neither building addresses directly and that the archive establishes without ambiguity. The Resolute desk sits in the Oval Office. It has been used by most presidents since Rutherford B. Hayes received it in 1880. The desk was made from the timbers of HMS Resolute, a British Royal Navy Arctic exploration vessel that became icebound in 1854, was abandoned by its crew, recovered by American whalers in the Davis Strait, refitted at an American port, and returned to Britain as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill in 1856. When the ship was decommissioned in 1879, Queen Victoria had 2 desks constructed from its timber and presented one to President Hayes. The desk built from a British naval vessel now sits in the executive office that was rebuilt after British forces burned it to the walls. That symmetry is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of documented record on both sides of the Atlantic. What the record does not resolve is a question of framing rather than fact. The standard narrative of the White House presents the building as a symbol of American permanence and institutional continuity, a structure that has housed every president since John Adams, that has endured crises and transitions across more than 2 centuries. That narrative is accurate. It is also incomplete. The permanence it describes was not inherited from an unbroken structure. It was reconstructed deliberately at considerable engineering cost. From walls that had been burned by an occupying army, patched in haste, and painted over so that the evidence of what had happened would not be visible from Pennsylvania Avenue. The walls are still there. The fire damage, confirmed in Truman-era engineering records, lies beneath the paint. The Resolute desk is in current use. The aide-de-camp's letter describing the dinner the British officers ate before the fire is in the newspaper archive. Every element of this story is documented. None of it is on the tour. The White House's history is concealed by the most ordinary of materials. White paint, applied 2 centuries ago, reapplied across every subsequent renovation, covering stone that remembers a night the official narrative has chosen not to foreground. Number 1 carries a different weight entirely. The building at number 1 was not burned and rebuilt. It was constructed over 7 decades through a war toward a dome that was raised while the nation it represented was tearing itself apart, by people whose names were recorded in payment ledgers and then not spoken aloud again for nearly 200 years. Number 1. The United States Capitol, Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. The building where the laws of a free republic are debated, passed, and signed was built, in significant part, by people who had no legal standing under those laws. The records documenting their names, their labor, and their contributions sat in the National Archives for nearly 200 years before the institution that manages the building formally studied them. The study was published in 2005. The plaque acknowledging what it found was installed in 2012. The cornerstone had been laid in 1793. The Capitol was constructed using enslaved labor from the outset. This is not a matter of inference or interpretation. It is in the payment records. The federal government leased enslaved people from their enslavers, men who were paid for the use of human beings they claimed to own. The enslaved individuals received nothing. Their names appear in some of those ledgers not because anyone intended to honor them, but because they were necessary for tracking the labor inventory. Who had been delivered, who had been returned, how many days of work had been rendered, and at what per-month rate to the enslaver. The records are in the National Archives, in the files of the Commissioners of the District of Columbia. They have been there since the 1790s. The work they performed was not peripheral. Enslaved laborers quarried the sandstone used for the Capitol's exterior walls. The same Aquia Creek stone that was used for the White House, cut from the same Virginia quarry by workers in overlapping bondage. They performed the masonry that shaped the building's walls and columns. They did the carpentry and the metalwork. They cleared the ground. They were present at every major phase of construction from the laying of the cornerstone on September 18, 1793, through the Civil War era, when the dome was still rising above the city while the war over the institution that had built the building was being fought across its countryside. Philip Reed's name is documented in the foundry records of Clark Mills. Reed was an enslaved man whose skill in bronze and plaster casting was recognized and recorded by the foundry owner who held him. In 1860, a critical problem arose in the casting of the Statue of Freedom, the bronze figure that now stands at the apex of the Capitol dome, 19 feet 6 inches tall, facing east toward the dawn. The Italian sculptor commissioned to cast the statue could not assemble the plaster mold. The sections locked together in a configuration that resisted disassembly, and without separating them, the casting could not proceed. Reed devised the solution, a system of hinges, pulleys, and rigging that allowed the mold to be taken apart in sections and reassembled without destroying the piece. The casting proceeded. The Statue of Freedom was raised to the dome in December of 1863 during the Civil War, while Abraham Lincoln insisted the construction continue as a visible signal that the Union would endure. Reed had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in January of that same year. He continued working at the foundry after emancipation. His contribution to the Statue of Freedom was not publicly acknowledged until the architect of the Capitol published a formal study of enslaved labor on the Capitol's construction in 2005. That study identified approximately 400 enslaved individuals by name in the construction records. It noted explicitly that the records are incomplete. Some ledgers record only the number of workers and the payment total to enslavers without individual names. The actual number of enslaved workers involved in the Capitol's construction across its full history is estimated to be higher than 400. The study does not provide a revised total because the record does not support one. Philip Reed's name is not on the Statue of Freedom. It is not on any display in the Capitol Visitor Center. The 2005 study is available on the Architect of the Capitol's website. It is not incorporated into the standard Capitol tour script. What places this entry at number 1 is not scale alone, though the scale is significant. It is the nature of the gap. Every entry on this list describes a distance between the official account and the documented record. The Washington Monument's color line is written in stone and visible to anyone who looks up. The Hoover Dam's plaque counts 96 names against a record that documents more. Washington's letter to Tobias Lear is in the Library of Congress, stating the intent to deceive in the president's own hand. The Golden Gate Bridge's meeting minutes record 61 years of decisions. These are gaps of visibility, of classification, of institutional emphasis. The Capitol's gap is foundational in a specific sense. The building where the laws defining freedom, citizenship, and rights have been written and enacted since 1793 was built by people who possessed none of those things. The records establishing that fact were held in a federal archive through the entire history of the Republic's legal development, through the passage of the 13th Amendment, through Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights Act, through every piece of legislation that used the language of freedom, and were not formally studied and presented as institutional history until 212 years after the cornerstone was laid. Whether the long silence was deliberate policy or the accumulated inertia of an institution that did not look because it had not been required to look is, in the end, a distinction that the record cannot resolve with certainty. The records were there, the names were there. The study could have been commissioned at any point in the Capitol's history. It was commissioned in 2003 and published in 2005. The plaque followed 7 years later. The sandstone is in the walls. The payment ledgers are in the archive. The Statue of Freedom stands on the dome, facing east, cast from a mold that an enslaved man figured out how to open. The 2005 study exists. The gap between that study and the building's public interpretive program is still being closed, slowly, partially, and without any fixed endpoint on record. Every landmark on this list carries two histories, the one on the plaque and the one in the archive. The distance between them is not a failure of knowledge. It is a record of choice. What gets told, what gets omitted, and what gets written on a plaque 2 centuries after the fact. That is its own kind of history, one worth knowing. If Origins Archive is the kind of documented, unfiltered history you want, subscribe to this channel. There is more of it.